All right, so next segment we're going to talk about, there's this book that I have. It's called Debunking Howard Zinn, and it's by Mary Grabber. And it's basically about exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. I really recommend reading this book, especially because you understand that Howard Zinn poisoned the minds of millions of Americans. And the reason why these most young Americans have a hatred for America is because of Howard Zinn. So this book is vitally important for people to read. So they can get a balanced view to show that Howard Zinn was nothing but a liar.
Yeah, he tainted history.
He tainted history, yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about from page 92. I want to read some of this to you. In fact, the campaign to abolish slavery was a Western thing. That's deep. To abolish slavery didn't originate anywhere else but the Western world. That's huge.
Now think about that for a minute, dear listeners.
Think about that for a second. You think white people are so bad, but yet the very idea of freeing slavery came from white people.
Well, the thing that really gets me, and I've said this before, we probably talked about it on our podcast, is they always talk about the fact that we white people had slaves, but we never talk about the fact that we white people freed slaves.
Exactly. And okay, so as the great Orientalist historian Bernard Lewis put it, the institution of slavery had been practiced from time immemorial. It existed in all the ancient civilizations of Asia, Africa, Europe, and pre-Columbian America. Did I hear that? Pre-Columbian American. That means American Indians. Yep. It had been accepted and endorsed by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as other religions of the world. And it was not only African people who were enslaved. Slavery was a ubiquitous, I can't say that right. Ubiquitous institution in the early modern period. Writes Alan Galley, contemporary to the rise of African slavery in the Americas, millions of non-African people were enslaved. These include over 1 million Europeans in North Africa and perhaps more in the Ottoman Empire, as well as the European settlers taken in captivity in the New World by Indians, not to mention the enslavement of Indians by Indians and other tribes.
Oh, wow. So white slaves.
There you go.
Wow. I mean, look at the Roman Empire. I mean, they enslaved other white people.
Okay, now let's talk about. They always talk about how white people are so evil and racist, but they never talk about the Muslims. The Muslims did horrid things to black Africans that people don't even talk about.
They literally get a free pass.
So let's read this. So the Muslim role in slavery and the slave trade is ignored by Zinn, but in fact, it was through the Muslim countries of North Africa that black slaves were imported into Europe during the Middle Ages. By the end of the 18th century, the Islamic Middle East held the majority of the world's white chattel slaves. Wow. There you go. Okay, so the Arabs, like many in the West, held stereotypes about black men and women as highly sexed. When blacks appear in Islamic illustrations of court life, domestic life, and various outdoor scenes, they are depicted doing the lowly tasks assigned to them. Carrying a tray, pushing a broom, leading a horse, wielding a spade, pulling an oar or rope, or discharging some other subordinate or menial task. Slaves had limited rights under Islamic law, but it did not mean that they had equal opportunities, even within the institution of slavery itself. So, according to Sowell, Thomas Sowell, I believe, who else is Sowell? I believe it's him. The Arabs were notable as the most cruel of all slave masters. That's according to Thomas Sowell, I believe. Because who else is named Sowell? So it must be Thomas Sowell.
Yeah,
right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
He's a smart man. So basically, in 1849, 1,600 black slaves died of thirst as they were driven from Barnu to southern Libya. Between 100 or 200 boys between the ages of 8 and 10 were castrated. Every year at the Abu Tig in Upper Egypt, on the slave caravan route from Sudan to Cairo, the castrated boys would be sold at twice the normal price. Twice the normal price. Now, why did they castrate them? Because they made them into eunuchs. So what they did is Muslims had white harems, so they had sex slaves. So commonly Arab notables and caliphs and rulers, they had something called harems, and they would have basically let's say they could have 100 white women that were enslaved, and they would put these eunuchs in power over to control their white sex slaves.
Yeah, because they wouldn't have sex with them.
They have no balls,
yeah,
so they wouldn't have sex with them. So they were able to control them, and they would trust them because they wouldn't have sex with them because they had no balls. Mm-hmm. So they were considered a higher commodity, and they would buy them at a higher price. Listen to this. The last Muslim country to abolish slavery was Mauritania in the year Zinn's books came out, 1980.
Yeah, I knew that.
1980. What does that tell
So
you?
we were alive then.
We were actually alive during
I was born
Black
in
slavery.
78. I was alive then.
So this tells you that the slavery was an institution that was going on.
It's we had
still going on.
Well, I was
listen to this. This is exactly what you're going to talk about. It already says it. I guarantee you. It says this. There is still slavery in Africa to this day.
There it is. Yeah.
An estimated 9.2 million Africans live in servitude without the choice to do so at the highest rate in the world, according to the 2018 Global Slavery
Even
Index.
black people enslaved their own people.
And it's going on today. And do you see any of these black people talking against it today?
Nope.
They don't.
Nope.
They don't.
No one's talking about against it. It's just hate white people.
So, listen to this. Nobel Prize-winning economic historian Robert William Fogel has shown that American slaves were better nourished than many other groups, including most European workers during the 19th century.
Yeah, I knew that because they used to, many things that I've read about, because they've actually, what is that movie, that Disney movie, the Songs of the South, and they literally had to abolish that movie because they depict slavery as not this horrible, god-awful thing, that some of these slaves, many of these slaves were actually treated very well.
Exactly. Frederick Douglass saw it differently. In 1876, more than a decade after the president had been assassinated for his anti-slavery position, let's just be honest that Abraham Lincoln was killed because of his anti-slavery position. That was one of the reasons why they murdered him, they assassinated him.
Yeah.
Douglass said Abraham Lincoln was at the head of a great movement and was in living and earnest sympathy with that movement, which in the nature of things must go on until slavery should be utterly and forever abolished in the United States. For Zinn, the real horrors of slavery are simply more fodder for his war against America and Western civilization. Nearly 750,000 dead in the Civil War are just casualties of a military machine, and blacks are no better off than they were under slavery. Under only at a particular historical moment, and only in the West, did a evolving understanding of personal freedom influenced by evangelical Christianity emerge to assert as a universal that the enslavement of human beings was moral wrong for anyone, anywhere. So Western civilization is the one that freed the slaves, and the bottom line is that slavery was practiced everywhere, was practiced in every continent, and it was more badly done in the Islamic world than it was in the Western world.
So today in modern times you have slavery in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, in Asia. The only place you don't find slavery is in the Western world.
Exactly. So you're calling the Western world as so bad, yet we're the ones that freed the slaves. Now I want you to think about this.
This is something that we should be proud of, not feeling white guilt over.
That we freed the slaves. We should be proud of that.
We had a black president. I mean,
yeah, but I want you to think about this. Now, I've been talking about this and I've been thinking about this. So if you look at any time in history, if somebody was freed as a slave, they would be forever grateful for that person that freed them. Mm-hmm. Think about any time in slavery. It was a gift to be freed from slavery. Show me one time in history where somebody got the privilege of being freed and they asked for reparations from their former slave master.
Right.
Did you show me one time in history where that ever happened?
Right.
This never happened, has it?
Not that I know of. And you figured that these slave masters would laugh and just put them back in chains.
Exactly. So the fact is that if you were given your freedom, that was a gift that was usually given, and usually they got that gift because they were honorable people. Because number one, they might have bought themselves out of slavery, or number two, they showed really good character, and they basically that's one of the reasons why they got freed from slavery.
Well, from what I've read in the South, many slave owners let their slaves go and encouraged them to go west because west was less likely to be racist towards the blacks. I mean, something like 25% of the cowboys in Texas were black. Many people don't know that. 25% of cowboys in Texas were black at that time.
Now, I believe that the slave trade was horrific, and I'm not sitting there trying to say that this was not a horrific thing. All slavery was horrific. It was a bad practice.
Who the hell wants to be a slave?
Nobody wants to be a slave. And let's be honest, in history, if you were on the losing side of a war, you were most likely enslaved.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That's just the way it was.
Spoils of war.
Yeah, spoils of war.
Taking the women.
Yep, they would take the women as sex slaves, and that's what happened for thousands of years. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. That's just what happened. And if you're intellectually honest, you will understand that.
Exactly.
If you're not intellectually honest, you're not going to be able to accept
Well,
that.
if you're not intellectually honest, that you're not going to like anything that either one of us have to say.
Yeah, 'cause we're just being intellectually
That's what
honest.
the AAC is all about: is exposing the lies and showing the truth, regardless how beautiful or ugly it actually is.
So now let's look at the balance of power theory. Okay, let's say you got these colonial powers coming in. Let's say you got the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all these colonial powers again. And if they start bringing in slaves, okay, and let's say because slavery was practice, it was an accepted practice back then. It wasn't like today where slavery is just like no, it was accepted practice. If they're bringing in slaves, let's say you're England and France is bringing in 25,000 slaves. You have to balance that power now because they're going to become economically more superpowered than you.
Right.
So I have to go and enslave the same amount of slaves in order to balance that power. And that's just the way it is. And if you have any sense of intellectual honesty in you, you'll understand that. If you don't, you're not gonna accept that. Correct?
Yeah.
That's just a balance of power theory. So if Brazil has 25,000 slaves and I don't have that slaves, they're going to have more economic power than me and they're going to take me over. And so either I choose to balance that power or I choose to die.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
So you can have all the morality in the world you want. You can either choose to survive or you can choose to die because either you're going to be a superpower or you're going to be subjects of that colonial power. It's your choice.
Yeah.
Because your stance. And that's just the way it is. So I'm not sitting there trying to justify slavery. I'm saying slavery was an accepted practice back then. It happened. The New World came. There were colonial powers. They were at war with each other. They were competing each other. Who's going to be the most dominant? They brought in slaves. Slavery was an accepted practice back then. We freed the slaves. Literally, if it wasn't for the Western world freeing slaves, probably people would still be the whole world would be in slavery today.
Well, and what really irritates me, especially about what we're talking about, is everyone acts, especially in America, that America was the only country in the history of the world that had slavery. That is obviously completely ridiculous. Or like white people were the only ones to enslave another race of people, which is completely ridiculous.
Any time
that's what we're doing.
Anytime in history when one person conquered the other people, they became slaves.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it was, accept it or not. If you're intellectually honest, like I said again, you have to accept it. But if you're not intellectually honest, just turn it off now. I don't even want to deal with you.
Yeah, and it's this simple. Okay, Chris and I didn't invent the world. We just simply deal with it.
And we're just giving you what it is, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and that's what I would love to hear from any kind of news outlet or media, or you just don't get it, because going back to what we were saying earlier, people are so afraid to talk about these things, and these things need to come to light, because when these things come to light, then we can create solutions to solve where we are.
But you got to have the right information to have.
Absolutely.
That's what we're all about, just giving the right information to people. That's all we're about, so that we can make those decisions. But anyway, that's kind of the end of that segment. Next segment, we're going to talk about race relations currently in the United States of America.